Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm joined again by Keith Preston. This is our fourth entry in the U.S. foreign policy series. So tonight I wanted to begin with the discussion of the open door policy and how it ultimately led into U.S. tensions with Japan. So basically, the open door policy wasn't even originally an American policy, it was British. Because Britain was the big advocate of free trade in the 19th century. The open door policy was calculated to benefit English merchants by making sure that the treaty ports, the coastal ports that Europeans were allowed to do business in, were open to all Europeans, not just to those few that could control them. Now, in the 1890s, in the late 19th century in general, Russia in the north, France in the south, and Japan, and to a lesser extent Germany, were encroaching into China economically. So where their colonial empires would bang up against China, they'd start putting influence on them, on these local rulers, to then give them economic benefits. England was afraid that what that might lead to is they would then have concessions and block the British out. The British eventually sort of had a strange compromise with America. We'll get to that in a moment. They then decided, well, maybe they need their own zones of control to then make sure they don't get locked out of China. So what they do, but then the Americans get wind of it, and we sort of want to keep the open door going, even as England is beginning to move away from it. And with typical American moralizing, condemning U.S. imperial powers, right on the heels of our imperialist conquest of the Philippines, quite ironic, I suppose, telling them to play nice. And they added another thing, not just keeping China open to free trade, but respecting the territorial and administrative integrity of China. Now, we also gave a lot of mixed messages. We really never enforced the treaty, that policy. We thought that East Asia was sort of, why even bother knowing anything about East Asia? The Americans almost kind of prided themselves in ignorance of East Asian affairs. And China, as we know at the time, was divided between warlords and the central government. And there really was no government of China in the sense that anybody in the West would recognize a government of England or even some backward country like Spain or Serbia. And so the whole thing was very imprecisely worded and didn't really understand the situation that was going on in China at the time. Each of the great powers had interests that they thought they could best secure by one way or the other in China. And by sort of not even taking consideration about that, that put us in a bad way. A classic example of a breach of the open door policy was the Russo-Japanese War, where Russia and Japan fought for control of Korea and Manchuria. And the United States pretty much just accepted it as a fact and tried to mediate the peace under Teddy Roosevelt. I think he got the Nobel Peace Prize for that, for mediating the peace between Japan and Russia. But due to the fact that Americans were largely ignorant of East Asia, that Americans really never wanted to commit any force against anybody that broke the open door policy, it was kind of selective. So whenever the great powers would be asked, do you support this initiative? I mean, nobody's going to say no, it looks really bad. But they have all these provisions and provisos, some of which are self-serving, some of which, of course, were contingent upon the unique situation in China. And when the diplomats would come back, they would just tell the American people, oh yeah, it's a great success, without telling them at all about the lukewarm, tepid support from the other great powers, creating a false understanding of how successful we were foreign affairs. And of course, at the end of the day, the open door policy was mostly a weapon to use against Japan. We never really enforced it against England or France, who encroached upon China. We didn't even really use it against Russia that much. And of course, Russia had great territorial ambitions against China throughout much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The only nation that really irked our ire when it came to China was Japan. And so the open door policy was a sort of hypocritical position where, everybody else is expected to play by the rules, but we're not going to enforce the rules if anybody breaks them. And so we'll just it's all on you guys and nothing's on us. And of course, Japan not unreasonably began to see a trend in U.S. policy from the beginning of the 20th century up until 1941, where through all of these efforts, they came to the point where they realized, well, it's just we just can't reasonably deal with the Americans in this sphere of influence. And in his lectures on American diplomacy, titled American Diplomacy, George Kennan says that at no point between 1900 and 1941 did the Americans ever seriously attempt to understand the Japanese position in Asia and try to come to some amicable middle ground. It was always devil take the hindmost. And he argues in this lecture series that if we had done that, he can't guarantee Japan would have attacked Pearl Harbor, but he argues that it probably couldn't have been worse than it actually was. It would have likely been a good deal better. And I think Kennan is absolutely correct on this point, is that the open door policy was really only used against Japan. Now, for whatever reasons, we had an agenda against Japan, even though Russia or in England were just as aggressive in dismembering and gaining control of Chinese assets as Japan was. So it seems, you know, other than some sort of primitive tribal atavistic hatred of Japanese people, it seems difficult to explain why they would be the target rather than the Russians or the British. The further caveat is Japan was one of the great success stories of Westernization. After the Meiji Restoration, they actually looked to the United States and Great Britain for examples. The Japanese modeled their navy after the Royal Navy. The Japanese developed a great love for American culture, including baseball, which lasts to this day. So you would think of the two warring factions in China, Japan or Russia, Japan would have been more likely to be an American ally because they had a similar culture. They looked up to American culture and wanted to adapt American ways. If I'm not mistaken, when they organized their constitution, they incorporated elements from both European and US constitutions at the time. Whereas Russia was this backward autocratic regime, and then in the 20s and 30s and beyond, a dangerous expansionist communist power. So to wrap up the open door policy, it was ill-conceived, ill-defined, governed more by a kind of uniquely American moralizing rather than sober, hard-headed realpolitik, and was selectively enforced against Japan. So what are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, I think it's possible to explain the roots of the conflict between the United States and Japan precisely by referring to the series of events that you just described. The reason that the United States had such enmity with Japan during the 19th century and leading into the 20th century has to do with precisely what you've been talking about, and that is the fact that Japan was trying to develop itself as a nation, and that Japan was in the process of actually becoming westernized. During the 19th century, both Japan and China were extraordinarily backward and underdeveloped societies. The difference between the two, however, is that the elite within Japan made a conscious effort to recognize how underdeveloped they actually were and to try to turn that around. And they did that in large part by emulating England and the United States and Europe. They wanted Japan to become a modern industrial state like what was developing in the West at the time. The Chinese did not. The Chinese were extraordinarily xenophobic. Even during the time that they finally allowed Western traders to engage in business with China, they would actually expect the Western trade ships to conduct their business from the ship. I mean, they would allow Western trade ships to dock in Chinese seaports, like in Shanghai and places like that, but they wouldn't even let Western merchants come off the boat in some instances, or if they did, they had to stay right there within the port area. Westerners were not allowed to venture into China because China was that afraid of cultural contamination from the West. So that is probably one of the primary reasons that China remained as backward as it was well into the 20th century, well into the era of Mao. In fact, just recently, a friend of mine was telling me about having traveled in China in the 1980s, and even as recently as the 1980s in some of these major Chinese cities like Beijing and Shanghai, you didn't see buildings more than a few stories high. So Chinese xenophobia has always been a problem as far as any kind of internal development, economic and cultural and social development. Now, the Japanese took exactly the opposite approach beginning in the 19th century. they started to develop the idea that they wanted to become a Western industrial society. But that led to the conflict between them and the United States. The reason that the United States wanted to exclude them from the way that they did through the open door policy had to do with the fact that the United States saw the Japanese as their primary competitors in the Pacific. The United States during this time was engaged in a great deal of very aggressive expansion into the Pacific. The United States had essentially conquered and annexed Hawaii, Guam, what is now called American Samoa, the Philippines, all of these different territories. So the United States viewed the Pacific as its legitimate sphere of influence. They saw the Americans saw an industrialized, westernized Japan as a rising power in the East, as very much a threat to the maintenance of American hegemony in the Pacific, in a way that the Russians and the English were not, due to geographical considerations and things like that. I mean, first, the Russians, as you said, were extraordinarily backward as well during this time. The British weren't, obviously, but there's a bit of a geographical barrier to the exercise of a successful British imperialism in the Pacific in a way that there wasn't with the Japanese. So the Americans were afraid of the rise of the Japanese as a dominant power in East Asia, and that is the real source of the enmity between the Americans and the Japanese, in spite of the fact that the Japanese were so enamored of American culture and politics and technology and all these kinds of things.
Yes, and what's interesting is this gets also to the principle of blowback, because when in 1858 Commodore Perry, among one of many Western admirals that went to Asia to intimidate Japan to open up, which was in its own isolation as a xenophobic stage, we are in fact directly responsible for that change in Japanese values that we then later came to regret. So the very actions of Commodore Perry, who of course was famous for his service in the Civil War and the Spanish War, in part is what led Japan on this new directive. One of the things that Kennan also points out in his lecture series is that it wasn't that nobody was unaware of the consequences of eliminating Japan as a great power. He quotes John V.A. McCurry, who I won't read at the moment in its totality, but he argues that if Japan were defeated, what benefit would arise? Either Russia or China would take its place. And is that any benefit to the United States? In fact, at the end of his section on American open door policy, he wrote this in 1950. This was spoken in 1950, in the middle of the Korean War. And he says, this is the same battleground the Japanese and the Russians were fighting over 50 years earlier. And the point is, what did we actually gain? We didn't actually change the balance of power at all. And whereas a game that was held in tension between Russia and Japan was now our job to fight instead of Japan's. So in fact, we overextended ourselves with needless blood and treasure, fighting a fight that the Japanese were more than happy to fight in our stead. Japan saw itself as the example of the England of the East. They wanted to be seen as they wanted to ape Anglo-Saxon values as much as possible, which from an Anglo-Saxon perspective should be a good thing. And from the English perspective was, because the English did sign a treaty with Japan in 1902, and it lasted for about 20 years. It was finally dissolved in 1923 due to pressure from the United States, which of course led to disastrous consequences for England in World War II when the Japanese conquered many of their eastern colonies. And so the British could see Japan as a workable ally or asset in this issue. The other problem is it cannot be stressed enough that China as a political entity did not exist at really any point between 1890 and 1950. As a political entity, China, prior to the revolution of 1911, was a ramshackle autocratic kingdom stuck in the Middle Ages, where it had warlord armies that were equipped with Western technology and weapons that were often more powerful than the emperor himself. Part of that goes back to the putting down of the Taiping Rebellion in the 1860s, when powerful generals were trained by British and French forces to put down the rebellion, and then they turned against the central government they were serving. And much of China was just a anarchy. I mean, China was in a state of anarchy. And when the nationalists take over in 1911 and beyond with Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, again, it's basically anarchy. And one of the great concerns of Japan with China was actually more incidental to Japanese policy than Russia was. Russia was the main threat, both czars and communist. But they were afraid that the Chinese instability could be exploited to undermine their presence in the East. Not an unwarranted assumption, as we see in the 1930s, the Soviets were actively collaborating to bring China in against Japan. So that was one of the issues at stake here. But the Americans gunning for Japan, there was a secret Politburo meeting that Lenin spoke at, where he said that the American industrialist Vanderlip, who had wanted a concession in Kamchatka, which at that point was run by Japan, it was in 1920, Lenin went ahead and gave him the concession because it wasn't his to give in the first place, and it later reneged on it when he took over Kamchatka. But he said that Vanderlip threatened him by saying that there will be a war with Japan in the future, and you want to be on the right side of that conflict. And I'm thinking to myself, Japan was your ally in World War I not 2 years ago. And now you're behind the scenes threatening other nations to get on your side of a war against Japan. It shows you how deep-seated this enmity was, and really not only how unprincipled it was. You would ally with gangsters like Lenin against. In 1920, Japan was still a pretty moderate, liberal Western society. And to side with a gangster like Lenin against Japan and their long-term strategic goals really shows you not only how short-sighted, but how unprincipled this whole policy was.
Yeah, well, this may be getting a little ahead of the discussion, but as far as what you were saying about Kennan's observations about what the consequences of the defeat of Japan in World War II was, Americans have this idea that World War II was this noble crusade for democracy against fascism, and that's still how it's portrayed even today, and that's how it was portrayed back then. But the war between the Western liberal democracies, mostly the United States, France, and England, against the Axis alliance, was really just sort of a sideshow in that particular war. I mean, the real essence, ideological conflict in World War II was between fascism and communism. That's where the real fighting was done. Not only in Eastern Europe between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, but also in East Asia between Imperial Japan and between the various resistance forces in Asia itself, which were led by communists for the most part. If we want to know where Kim Il-sung came from, he was a guerrilla fighter against the Japanese occupation of Korea during World War II. Mao was a leader of the Chinese resistance to the Japanese invasion during the Second World War, well before that, and so was Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and into China. So the consequence of the defeat of Imperial Japan in World War II was that much of the Asian continent fell under the leadership of communism. Without Japan as a bulwark against that, there was really no stopping the wave of communist revolutions that happened immediately after the war in North Vietnam and China and in North Korea. And in fact, if the United States had not intervened in Korea in the early 1950s, the entire Korean peninsula today would be under the rule of the Kim family. So that's really what the world got as a result of the destruction of Imperial Japan. The United States went in and incinerated multiple cities in Japan, only to create a safe space for Maoism and Kimism and Hoism on the Asian continent.
Yeah, it's amazing how the ripple effect of a bad policy in the 1900s, early 1900s, can ripple through like that. The next major shift in U.S. policy was the Great Rapprochement between England and the United States. One of the things that's so unusual is that the United States had been an enemy of England for a very long time. I mean, after all, we won our independence against England. They had for the better part of 100 years, we had been at loggerheads with England. Now, partly what led this change was England in the 1890s. Its empire was at its more or less its maximum extent, and the legacy, the initial advantage that it had due to industrialization, giving it economic control over the world. The gaps were closing. Germany was industrializing, Japan was industrializing, the United States and France were industrializing, and England could no longer rest on its laurels as easily as it had done in the post-Napoleonic consensus. And so what England realized is it needed to start making some strategic friends. The first attempt was with the United States, which we call the Great Rapprochement. I think alone of the great powers, Britain was on the US side of the Spanish-American War. And the United States, alone among the great powers, was on Britain's side during the Boer War. And they both, and this is possibly apocryphal, but it's been attributed to Bismarck, that he said that the most important aspect of the 20th century would be that North Americans speak English. Whether apocryphal or no, that is very true statement. And one can probably understand this, that even though they had an animosity at their coming to be, the United States and England, they're both English. You know, the leadership were the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, of a similar ethnic group to the English. So I suppose it is only natural, given time, that some mending of the bridges would take place. The other attempt that England made to build allies abroad was with Japan in the 1902 Anglo-Japanese Treaty. Now, that treaty gave Japan the courage to fight the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, one of the legacies of this great rapprochement we see even today. Whenever America goes to war in the Middle East, England is sure to follow. And much as in the first half of the 20th century, whenever England went to war, we were sure to follow. And it cannot be stressed how important and disastrous this was. Because on the one hand, Americans were dragged into numerous conflicts that were none of our business, and in no material way benefited the American people. Second of all, England was more aggressive than it would otherwise have been, knowing that America was the 800-pound gorilla in the corner waiting to bail it out. In both world wars, the Americans, in no uncertain terms, Wilson and Roosevelt, gave secret communiques to the British saying that we will join this war, just give us time to get involved. Because they had to, get the PR set up, make the guys look like the aggressors, and then they could join. And of course, England, now being the junior partner rather than the senior partner, is still drug along on American wars in the Middle East, which are not to England's interest either. Many Englishmen today don't support the wars in the Middle East that they've been involved in since 2003. And so this tremendous shift of realigning of tectonic plates of empires was really earth-shattering. And I think in large part, England's aggressive stance in the First World War would be impossible to explain without the Great Rapprochement and the implied view that America would back them up. If you look at England's policy in the 19th century without American support, with America as actively a hostile neighbor, they were far more moderated in their view of Europe. They weren't going on these insane crusades to make the world safe for democracy. They tried to maintain a rough balance of power and not really keep any one power too angry at them for too long. But after the Americans come into the English corner, more or less joined at the hip, the English, you can see the change in their policy, feel more emboldened, and they're more aggressive. And that is in part explains the two world wars and England's role in them.
Well, when we look at how the Great Rapprochement between America and England came into being, I think there's a number of factors that explain that, and I think they have to do with the changes that took place in Western civilization throughout the 19th century. Back when America and England went to war for American independence back in the 18th century, to some degree that was a class war between the kind of middling class, the kind of gentry and merchant class that you had that was dominant in the United States, versus the traditional British monarchy and aristocracy and the Church of England and all of that. I think it's sort of like a lightweight version of the French Revolution in many ways. But by the end of the 19th century, or late 19th century, all of that had started to change, where you, in both countries, in England and in America, you had a very deeply entrenched capitalist industrial merchant class. And the older elites in England were very much on the decline. So the two countries, economically, culturally, politically, had very much come to resemble each other, where they were, not very different from each other at all. Not just in terms of language, but just in terms of their social structures and the level of economic development and all of these kinds of things. So it made perfect sense that there would be a rapprochement between England and America during the latter part of the 19th century because of this. Also, as the British Empire expanded and Britain came to dominate about a third of the world, something like that, I think the Americans always viewed themselves as having an opportunity to sort of ride the coattails of the British. I think the Americans looked at it like, by being allies with the British, they could actually essentially, share in the empire in many ways, and perhaps even eclipse the British in terms of dominating the empire, which essentially is what they did after World War II, after all the European nations were left in ruins after World War II. I think it's the rapprochement between England and America was actually similar to the rapprochement that happened between the U.S. North and South in the late 19th century and early 20th century, in the sense that, while they had previously fought this bloody civil war, there started to be a rapprochement between the two, and the South started to become a bastion of American nationalism, as it still is today. And I think this also had to do with the same kinds of changes. I think that the antebellum South was more of an old European type of society, certainly much more than the North was, more than the Protestant, Puritan, industrial, mercantile society that existed in the North. The traditional South tended to be a lot closer to being a traditional European society. That was less the case after the Civil War, after Reconstruction and all of that. I mean, by that time, the South was evolving into a modern industrial capitalist society. In fact, even in the 20th century, if you look at issues like desegregation and things like that, civil rights and all of that, resistance to that came more from the working to middle classes, white working to middle classes in the South, and less from the elite. During the 20th century, much of the Southern elite, the Chamber of Commerce types and all that, were very open to desegregation. They were interested in business. They wanted to open all of the South up to business from the North, and they thought that the segregation system was an anachronistic embarrassment and things like that. So this same kind of rapprochement happens there as well. And this, I think, has to do with to venture off into quasi-Marxist sounding territory here. I think it's really the representation of industrial capitalism becoming as deeply entrenched as it became by this time. By this time, the Industrial Revolution was fully established. What Marx called the bourgeoisie was really the dominant class at this point, and all of these older royalist, aristocratic, more traditionalist values had started to fade out in many of these places, both in England and in the United States, and in both the North and the South in the United States. So it makes sense that, as being the most advanced industrial capitalist powers of the time, that England and America would certainly have moved closer together, given the shared cultural history and linguistic history and religious history and all of that they had as well.
Yeah. Now, when we get to the First World War, and specifically America's involvement in it, first and foremost, it's clear that America's involvement in the First World War was the result of financial investment. Anybody can read War is a Racket by Smedley Butler, the famous U.S. Marine who was responsible for exposing the conspiracy to overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. And in War is a Racket, he basically argued, and he gave evidence for the amounts of bills that were changing hands, is that the Western Allies were losing the war. And they had borrowed a lot of money from us to prosecute the war. And we apparently calculated that the costs to go to war to recoup the war loss, the debts would be lower, more cost effective than going to war and losing money. One of the things, that's sort of where it really boils down to. Now, the other thing that it goes down to it is Wilson was a fanatical Anglophile, as were the people he hung around. That's also certainly the case. Incidents like the Lusitania and the I forget the Zimmerman telegram are of course trotted out as excuses for why, but those are merely pretexts. Anybody who sees the pretext instead of the real cause is just being naive. The Lusitania, of course, was a cold political ploy by the British, with people like Winston Churchill knowingly allowing American citizens to go on a ship that would go into a war zone with the hope that it would get sunk. And then, of course, you had the Zimmerman note, which was admittedly ill-advised, but there's no way the Germans could have actually supported Mexico in any effort to give them the land that they had lost in 1848. But what's so striking, though, is the American hypocrisy when it comes to the rights of neutrals. America styled itself as a neutral during the first 3 years of the war, and argued that the great powers were violating its neutrality. So when the German U-boats would sink ships, or when the British would issue blockades preventing American shipping from entering into other European countries. But the United States never, on principle, objected to or challenged the British right to violate the rights of neutrals on the high seas. For instance, when they would impound ships, we only put up token protests. Whereas when the Germans sunk one of ours, we'd cry bloody murder. The other thing is the English had the Q ships. They would have merchant vessels with weapons on them. According to the Geneva Conventions, a U-boat was supposed to surface, declare its intentions, help in the evacuation of the commercial vessel, and then sink it. Now, the British took advantage of that by placing, deck guns, if you will, on merchant ships in hidden locations. And when the U-boats would pop up to comply with the Geneva Conventions, they get blown out of the water. And sooner or later, the U-boat captains quit doing that because it was suicidal to do that. And yet the Americans made no protest at this gross, negligent violation of international rights. Furthermore, the English ships would often fly under false flags, including the U.S. flag, neutral flags. Again, a clear violation of neutral territory. But every violation of neutral rights on the high seas, the United States, if performed by the British, meekly acquiesced to. And when the Germans did it, they would scream bloody murder. Now, of course, the Germans were under tremendous duress during this whole time. And their very existence as an empire was at stake. Whereas England had very little at stake as far as even if it had lost the war, was Germany going to invade London and burn it to the ground? No. No, of course not. Germany lacked the means to do so, and I don't even think it had the will to do so. And so the fact that America essentially sides with the bully on the high seas rather than the nation that's being slowly strangled to death by the blockade is very telling in America's motivations and rationale to go for the war. I think also in part too is if you go back to the American Doughboys, there was a song where one of the lines was referring to Lafayette in his service to the French Revolution, and they said they came back to Paris to pay back the debts to Lafayette. So there are certain cultural connections with the French as well. They're a sister republic. The French had helped us out in the American Revolution before, and so there is this sort of also not the same extent as with England, but a weaker cultural connection with the French, which helped us identify with the French nation during that war. And at the whole time, we're being inundated by English propaganda, absurd stories of German soldiers raping nuns and mutilating children and decapitating prisoners of war. None of which was ever verified. It was completely specious. And even the shooting of Belgian civilians to crack down on partisan activity. We put this into context. In the Boer War, when the British were destroying the partisans of the Afrikaners, the Boers, something like 30,000+ men, women, and children, mostly women and children, were murdered in concentration camps. Now, last I checked in Belgium, the Germans weren't running concentration camps, and they weren't targeting women and children. They were targeting men of military age to discourage them from joining in partisan activity. It's, the British did it in the American Revolution when they executed bushwhackers. We did it in the Civil War when we arrested Confederate bushwhackers. It's a common practice. And yet when the Germans do it to a degree which is no worse, and certainly a good deal less worse than what the British did in South Africa, it's blown completely out of proportions. And during this entire 3-year period, the United States was in no way could be considered a neutral. It would be considered a co-belligerent because it was actively selling armaments to the Allies, specifically Britain and France, and none to the Germans. And in fact, the Germans were far better prepared for the war at the onset industrially. And if the Americans had not made massive arms sales to the Allies in the early years of the war, any attempt of Western Allied resistance to the Germans would have been severely hampered and would have been limited mostly to defensive activities rather than the great offensives that we saw at the Somme or in the Aisne River region in 1915. None of those things would have been possible without the massive American aid prior to their own industries getting up to speed. And so really, America never was a neutral in World War I, had always declared its intentions for England, privately and implicitly publicly. And it was only a matter of time before America got involved in the conflict on the side of the Allies, against the wishes of most American people. This kind of gets back to the secret cabal that Kennan talks about in the Spanish-American War. People at very high levels who are planning actions without consulting the American people and leading to results that are actually in direct conflict with what the interests of the American people actually are.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good overview of what actually led the United States into the First World War. And I think that some of these other factors I was talking about earlier figured into this as well. Not only did the United States have a large financial investment in the outcome of the war in terms of the loans that had been given to England, but it was also true that the Americans and the British shared a similar view of the Germans as being this kind of retrograde royal society. It's the same kind of Jacobin ideology that drove a lot of earlier wars prior to this, for example, the American Civil War. The propaganda that you mentioned that came out of World War I that depicted the Huns as these barbarians was rooted in that. It was rooted in this idea that the First World War was this righteous crusade for democracy or liberalism or republicanism against Prussian militarism, which is absolute nonsense. But Germany was a very advanced, relatively progressive society at the time. I mean, they weren't a liberal society in the same way that the British or the Americans or the French were, but they were certainly a progressive Western society. In fact, even a lot of the left got taken in by this kind of propaganda. You had anarchists like Benjamin Tucker, who was living in France at the time, or Kropotkin in Russia, who actually supported the Allied cause, believe it or not. Also, I think the role of Wilson is really essential because Wilson, in many ways, represented a convergence of the kinds of things that I was talking about before, in the sense that Wilson was from the South. He was from Virginia. He was something of a Southern traditionalist. He was certainly a believer in segregation. He had the silent film "Birth of a Nation" shown at the White House, which is about the Ku Klux Klan. He implemented segregation in the civil service. So he was something of a Southern traditionalist in many ways, but he also had this very Jacobin-like view of liberalism in the sense that he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. He thought that eliminating the Prussian or the Germans would have the effect of eliminating European militarism. He wanted to create this World Federations, League of Nations that would essentially criminalize war. So he represented the kind of convergence that happened in the United States, where the traditional Southern elite sort of underwent a transformation and became more of a modern industrial bourgeois elite, just like existed in the North. And likewise, the rapprochement between the United States and England, once this particular frame of mind, this particular ideological outlook, and once this particular uh, social classes became dominant as well. All of that, I think, fed into the First World War in a big way. This kind of ideological conflict between the old world and the new world, and between liberalism and traditionalism and so forth. Also, once again, I think a big part of America's motivation for entering that war was simply being main chancers, not only in the sense of the financial investment that had been made in terms of loans that had been given to England, but also the fact that the Americans, I think, saw themselves as having a greater chance of becoming a major world power and a dominant world power by throwing in their lot with England. I think that the Americans were concerned that a European continent that was dominated heavily by the Germans would have undermined their own chances as far as becoming a world power, an international power. I think they thought it was a lot easier to ride the coattails of the British and eventually eclipse the British than it would have been with the Germans. And they were probably right in that assessment. I mean, if you're an American policymaker, your goal was to develop the United States into a world empire, then certainly I think strategically aligning yourself with the British would have been better than hoping for a German victory in that particular war. Even though the outcome of the war, of course, was disastrous. I mean, it was probably one of the worst things that happened in history. The destruction of Germany in World War I was a terrible thing that created all kinds of serious consequences for that are really still going on today in many ways.
Yeah, and one of the things that is often brought up, Kennan brings this up, even though he advocates for correctly that the U.S. war goal should have been one of more of moderation, not total victory, but a maintenance of the balance of power. And he cites Mr. Louis Einstein, 1913, who made a prediction of what a war would do to Europe if the balance of power were fundamentally altered, which he was largely correct. But here's the thing: there's this sort of like almost atavistic attachment to saving England, and American policy after the Great Rapprochement. Now, given the disastrous consequences of fighting 2 wars to save England, you have to ask ourselves, why was that even a great concern to the United States? Because first of all, if England had even lost World War I, they weren't going to be conquered. They would have been weakened, but they wouldn't have been conquered, and the empire would have been largely intact. So it's not like England was going to cease to be as a great power. A defeat in World War II might have been a little more severe, but again, the Nazis were not in no position to invade England. It doesn't seem to be in the long run a very intelligent thing to do. But the real catastrophe, as you hinted at already, was the fallout. The rise of international communism and Bolshevism in Moscow, the loss of millions of Europeans' lives that were completely just evaporated. What great scientists, artists, musicians, theologians, men of letters could have been born and existed had this catastrophe not happened. And after the war had started, rather than ameliorating the conditions, we stoked the flames of the fire, making sure the worst possible outcome did happen, the rise of communism in Russia, and then laying the seeds in other parts of the world, like in China and in the Orient and in even Eastern Europe, for the Soviets to then, in the next war, expand well beyond the Eurasian landmass and limitations. See, Russia is a great power, has never been a naval power. Even under the brief period of the Soviet Navy in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of a one-trick pony, right? If they lost the first throw of the dice, they weren't going to win the naval war. And their ships were of an inferior quality to our own, even if they were more numerous. What gave Russia such a unique advantage in the Cold War was not its naval might, because like I said, up to the 70s and 80s, it didn't have any. It was its ideological might. It could project power all across the world through pure ideological projection, something that Tsarist Russia could never have done. And so, due to a whole host of factors. So what you did was you turned a relatively threatening, retrograde nation, which could be contained and could even be negotiated with in many senses, into a international juggernaut that threatens civilization itself. I mean, it's literally the worst possible outcome that could have been easily avoided at so many steps. The Middle East, the train wreck in the Middle East that we deal with today, is still the result of World War I. There's this famous, there was this one, I think, Vice interview where they interviewed a ISIS fighter, and he was standing, with one leg in Iraq and one leg in Syria, and he said, "Today the Sykes-Picot Treaty dies." And we see even today, people are motivated to undo the legacy of dissolving the Ottoman Empire. In the 90s, the breakup of Yugoslavia, a creation of the First World War, led to the ugly conflicts around there. There was the genocide in Bosnia. There was U.S. intervention in Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia. And really all for what? What was this, Kennan asks a very good question at the end of the article on the First World War in his lecture. Was the he's even talking back from 1950, looking at the world wars in general. Given the tremendous cost and loss of life, was it worth for the Americans and the West in general to have gone through these conflicts the way that they did? Because whether you talk about the Kaiser's Germany or Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, how the Allies, America and Britain, responded are just as important as how they responded. And the goals that we were ostensibly fighting for, were they worth these tens of millions of dead people, the massive destruction of nations, and of course from his time fighting communist aggression in Korea? And I think any sane person would have to say no. I mean, hundreds of millions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of lives were lost in conflicts that rippled out from the Great War itself, and then wars that were subsequent to that. And the fact that we're still living with that today, the partition of the Middle Eastern countries is a result of the First World War. The Yugoslav difficulties, or the former Yugoslavia, was a result of the First World War. And the current crisis in Asia is a direct result of we have against China and with Taiwan and North Korea and South Korea, is a directly a result of our open door policy, our efforts in World War I, and then ultimately our efforts in World War II. And as he says in his lecture series, America was less secure in 1950 than at any point in its history prior. Because now, of course, the enemy can, nuke you from half the world away, and there's this internationalist threat. So at the end of the day, the Americans have this unique ability to ignore consequences. They ignore consequences of actions. They have this strange belief, and he even points this out in the lectures, that we can transcend history. That, Germany being the heart of Europe for a millennium, going back to Otto the Great, or, Russia being kept in check by either Poland or Germany or some other great power, Sweden, and just annihilating all these dominoes that stand in their way is actually a good thing. Or in East Asia, the balance of power there. China was uncharacteristically weak in the late 19th and 20th centuries. But again, this idea that nations and habits and traditions that have gone on for a millennium or more can be so easily ignored and swept away with no consideration to what would actually result. He even says that when Wilson argued for total war in World War I to make the world safe for democracy, it's a world where war is criminalized, where democracy is the norm and people have a say in the government all over the world, and it's going to be one great campfire kumbaya session. And of course, if that's the end game, then why not kill tens of millions of people to do it? But of course, even as early as 1919, we could see that the great promises that Wilson had boasted of were just so much phantoms. They were just phantoms, and gossamer blown away by the wind. And rather from learning from that lesson, we repeated the same mistake again in World War II, and now we repeated the same mistake at the end of the Cold War with these grandiose proclamations of democracy in the Middle East, when it's never actually ever worked. It's unbelievable that Americans are generally incapable of learning from these mistakes.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the example of the Ottoman Empire, because a lot of people are not familiar with that legacy and that part of the fallout of World War I. There are some people that are familiar with the impact of the Versailles Treaty that was imposed on Germany after the war. And there are probably even some people who are familiar with the consequences in Russia of the First World War. It was largely because of that war that the Bolshevik Revolution happened. Without the war, I don't think that war would have happened, that revolution would have happened either. But another consequence was the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. If we look at the events that have occurred in the Middle East since the destruction of the Ottomans, who would not bring back, who in their right mind would not bring back the Ottomans in exchange for the kinds of regimes that have existed in those countries since that time? Now, who would not trade in the Saudis, for example, in exchange for bringing back the Ottomans? Or just like in Russia, who would not trade in virtually all of the regimes that have existed in Russia, at least since certainly in the 20th century, in exchange for bringing back the Romanovs? Or who would not trade in the Third Reich in exchange for bringing back Kaiser Wilhelm? So the legacy of this war was that it really laid waste to much of the world, not only in terms of the actual cost of the war itself, in terms of the devastation, casualties, and economic damage, but just in terms of the long-range political effects of this war. You had what were reasonably functional, reasonably stable societies that were in the process of developing at their own rate, whether Germany, whether Russia, whether Japan, whether the Ottoman Empire, essentially being undermined in favor of what? In favor of the kinds of extremist movements and extremist regimes that replaced them: Nazism, communism, the Japanese militarist regime of the 30s and 40s, the kind of Wahhabist fundamentalism that you see rising in the former Ottoman territories. World War I is really the catalyst that brings all of that into being. And as you were saying, this ideological framework that was rooted in was such a core part of that. As Wilson said, it was the war to make the world safe for democracy. It was the war to end all wars. After the war, they tried to behave very vindictively towards Germany. I mean, it was, what was done to Germany was the same thing the Americans did to the South in the Civil War. It wasn't just about winning the war; it was about being as punitive as possible. It was a very Jacobin approach of laying waste to an old society in order to build a new society. That's the approach that the Americans had to the Civil War. It was the approach that they had to the First World War, and that's exactly what they did. And the things we've been talking about were the consequences of that.
Yeah. Before we wrap up World War I, there's a couple points also. The idea that Germany, there's the Sonderwang thesis, the special path thesis, that Germany was somehow unique or different in a negative connotation, and of course in the context of the First World War that it was retrograde. Well, the Central Powers were retrograde. But this is actually, if you look at the historical record, the most absurd, lunatic position one could take. Austria-Hungary, a perfect example of the sick man of Europe. The murdered Archduke, had he lived, had he ascended the throne, which he would have had he was not assassinated, but one of the first things he was going to do when he ascended the throne of Austria-Hungary would have been to give every adult male in the empire the vote. Every adult male in the empire the vote. And the Serbian nationalist terrorists were afraid of this. But let's put some perspective here. In Ireland, at the same time, they were under the yoke of British rule, terribly persecuted. They had been starved to death 60 years earlier during the potato famine, and they were not even given home rule. And in the United States, Negroes weren't allowed to vote in elections. Well, they sort of were, but there were certain stipulations and restrictions. Austria-Hungary, at the stroke of a pen, was going to remove all of that and be overnight the most progressive nation in the world when it came to voting rights of adult males. Germany at the time had the first welfare system. Now, granted, it was somewhat cynically used by Bismarck to steal the thunder of the German Social Democrats, but nonetheless, that was the case. Germany had the most advanced and organized labor movement in the world, and probably had some of the best working conditions in the world. The Kaiser Wilhelm, in his domestic affairs prior to the war, was very concerned about the working class of Germany and passed a series of reform laws that greatly improved their working conditions. Now, I'm not an expert on German labor history, but under the Second Reich, I'm not familiar with any sort of violent protests like we would see in England, like with the Chartists or with the coal strikes in Pennsylvania under I can't think of his name now. I think it was Carnegie, and things like that. This really militant unrest. Now, granted, there was a socialist revolution in Germany after the war, but they lost the World War, just like Russia had. But even in Russia, you had Bloody Sunday when the Tsar had the Cossacks, shoot down all these protesters. Those kinds of things where the German army comes in to shoot down protesters. If it did happen, it doesn't seem to be as common as it was, say, like in the United States or Russia. In part because if you worked in the labor force in the First World, Germany was the best place to be a worker in, bar none, based on the level of education you'd receive, based on the level of protections you'd receive from the state against exploitation by corporate workers. And there are some socialist Marxist historians that will now admit this. And so it's very odd and patently absurd that one would call Germany reactionary. Furthermore, in Europe, it was the lingua franca of science of the first half of the 20th century was German. And then after that, it became English because of the US presence, but it was German. Germans were the leading scientists and industrialists in Europe. So by every possible matrix, Germany was far ahead of its Anglo rivals, and which is in part probably why the Anglo rivals wanted to wipe it out. Because it was really ticking off all the right boxes, even for leftist progressives, not just nationalists and or people from the old guard. It was kind of balancing both processes at the same time. It balanced the demands of popular representation and progressive labor reform, at the same time preserving elements of tradition. It was a more moderate and probably more sustainable transition from a feudal society to an industrial society. And we look at this, and it's just baffling. And as we pointed out as well, the legacy has been horrendous. Now, you've mentioned a couple times already, Keith, that the Americans believed that they could supplant England by being England's friend. And it's funny you should bring that up, because that is exactly how England overthrew the economic global hegemony of the Dutch. People tend to forget this, but Holland used to be they were the originators of global trade. And they were the global trading superpower for the better part of a century in the 17th century. And what happened was there were 3 Anglo-Dutch wars, and the English lost the last 2 of them. The English don't like to brag about it, but they got their butts kicked by the Dutch on the high seas, which is supposed to be England's, dominant sphere of influence. But rather than fight the Dutch directly, they destroyed them indirectly, because they would ally with the Dutch, but due to the great coalition wars of Europe, would force the Dutch to accept terms in treaties that were less favorable to them, ultimately culminating in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which I think ended the War of Spanish Succession, which led to the trade ports being shifted away from the Dutch to other countries, which then removed the primary maritime threat to England. And I have to wonder if this was all detailed in Alfred Thayer Mahan's the Influence of Sea Power on History. And one has to wonder, given the popularity of Mahan's work, if the United States was not intentionally trying to channel that legacy in their secret undermining of Britain.
Well, the point you've raised about the how progressive Germany was in the early 20th century is important. It's not true that Germany was some kind of backward state at the time at all, as you pointed out. The Germans were arguably the most advanced nation in the world, Germany and Austria-Hungary. In fact, Sigmund Freud used to say that he would not want to live anywhere outside the Austria-Hungary Empire because it was the best society on earth. And the Germans were probably the most, the Germans were probably the most educated and literate people by this time on a global basis. As you were saying, certainly they were one of the leading scientific power at the time, probably the most culturally advanced people. So the idea that they were this backward Hun society is nonsense. It was just war propaganda that was used to legitimize the war effort. The Germans were, if anything, much more progressive force in the ways that you mentioned. The Germans were much more progressive on labor issues. They were the first nation where a socialist party or a labor party actually became a major party, the German Social Democratic Party. And as you mentioned, Bismarck in part implemented a lot of labor reforms because of that in order to sort of take the wind out of the sails of the Social Democrats. So the powers of the West were still stuck in or the Western Europe, England and France and America were still essentially stuck in the 19th century during this time in a way that the Germans were not in terms of their overall level of economic and social development. The Germans were certainly surpassing these other countries, and I think would have continued to do so if it hadn't have been for the war. It's interesting to see, would have been interesting to see how Germany would have turned out if it hadn't have been for the First World War, and which there wouldn't have been a Second World War. There wouldn't have been a splitting of Germany down the middle after the Second World War. Germany, I think, probably would have emerged as a dominant world power in the 20th century. Instead of the Americans or the British or the Russians, probably the dominant power in the 20th century would have been the Germans, and they would have been the center of economic and industrial and technological development, cultural evolution and progress, and all of these other things. So that's really interesting to see what happened to the Germans is because of this war and what could have been otherwise. That would make for an interesting alternative history novel or something like that.
Oh, very much.
Yeah, what if there had never been a World War I? What would Germany have been in the 20th century?
Yeah, the last point I think to say on the First World War is that the damage it did to Europe that we still see today, it really kind of shows you the short-sightedness of the Anglo establishment. The real long-term enemies of the West were not fellow Westerners like Germans or French. They were, as predicted by Lothrop Stoddard in his book The Rising Tide of Color, the yellow and brown races of the world. They were the actual long-term threat. He predicted the rise of Islam. I mean, in 1920, if anybody said Islam would be a global threat once again, they would have laughed you to scorn. But Lothrop Stoddard was correct in his analysis about the threat of Islam. We see now with China and India becoming more aggressive and more muscular as they've developed their economies with their massive populations. They are becoming threats to Western civilization that the West is no longer fully capable of coping with. Europe today is wholly incapable of coping with the threat of Islam, a threat that would have been easily handled by their grandfathers in the First World War. The threat of Russia, which has never really gone away, it goes from a czar to a premier to a president, but the sort of half Asiatic Russian threat is also present today as well. And Europe is ill able to defend against either threat. Whereas in the First World War, the generation of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, Europe was more than competent to handle these challenges. And America is being stretched far too thin today to handle these multitude of threats. The threats from the Islamic world, the threats from Russia, the threats from the independent colonial powers like India or non-colonial powers like China. And Europe is now extremely vulnerable to these long-term century threats that it pretty much, the English and the French and Americans just shot the West in the foot, and it's in a very poor way able to defend its own life. I mean, it's literally struggling for its existence right now against these threats that should have been seen, and they were seen by men of foresight at the time. But for short-term gain against fellow Western powers like Germany or Austria or even Japan, they allowed for these atavistic terrors of Islam and communism, Russian Asiatic imperialism, Chinese despotism that goes back to the millennium. All of these threats were the actual long-term threats to the West, demographic threats, religious threats that intelligent analysts had seen and warned about. But in this very short-term, narrow-looking focus of beating the Germans or beating the Japanese in this sort of like short-term gain by destroying your Western rivals. Because at the end of the day, Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Italy have a lot more in common with the United States than China, whether it's Bolshevik or imperial, Russia, whether it's Bolshevik or imperial, Islamic jihadism, or any of those things. They have far more in common with us than we do with them. And yet we destroyed those nations that we had the most in common with, paving the way for the nations that not only had little to nothing in common with us, but whose stated objective is our own extinction. The communists' stated objective was to destroy Western civilization. Islam's stated objective since Abu Bakr in the 7th century has been the destruction of Western civilization and subjection to the one world caliphate. And yet those are the long-term threats we should have been worried about in the 1920s, in the 1910s, in the 1890s. But we weren't. And now Europe and America are they are far less able to defend their position that they would otherwise be had these mistakes not happened.
Well, essentially, there is no Europe anymore. I mean, Europe obviously still exists. It's a very wealthy region and very densely populated. But in terms of its power on the international level, that's largely dependent on their relationship with the United States. I mean, the European Union may be an economically powerful trading bloc, but militarily, Europe is nothing without NATO, and NATO is nothing without the United States. So, in many ways, Europe, since the end of World War II, has been, to the United States what the nations of the Warsaw Pact were to the Soviet Union in many ways. They're essentially military protectorates. It's interesting to see how the way that the geopolitical rivalries today are shaping up, in the sense that I think as much as any time we do see the kind of geopolitical rivalry you were referring to that Northrop Stoddard predicted, and that is, we see the BRIC axis forming in opposition to the West. That is Russia, China, India, Africa, and Latin America, the global South, and then they're also aligning themselves with Iran, with the Shia bloc generally. That whole axis is now challenging the Western or Atlanticist dominated bloc, which is the United States, NATO, England, the European Union, and then Israel, and then their allies in the Pacific Rim, now Japan and Australia and so forth, and of course the Saudi Sunni bloc as well. And it's interesting to see how it's almost the United States and its allies that have become the reactionary power worldwide. We see that the Chinese have gotten involved in economic development in Africa in a way that started to raise the standard of living of a number of the most backward African nations. Like the average annual income in some of those countries in the last 20 years has risen from, say, $300 a year to something like $5,000 a year, which is phenomenal in a place like that. We also see that a lot of the Latin American nations are turning their backs on the West and aligning themselves with the East, forming their own trade agreements with Eastern countries. We see the Russians making an effort to put together a Eurasian alliance against the Atlanticist powers. And all of this is largely an outgrowth of the destruction of the West that happened in the two world wars. You mentioned how the Dutch were once a major world power. That seems almost laughable now. In fact, I've thought about that when I've been in Holland at times. I've thought, well, wow, this little country used to be a major world power. It seems inconceivable. But that's really been the legacy of the First World War and the Second World War. Of course, without the First World War, there wouldn't have been a Second World War. So it really was the destruction of Western civilization.
Yeah. Now, as we shift to the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War and America's involvement in that, all too often his yeoman work has been ignored, and nobody who claims to know anything about the Russian Revolution or Civil War cannot begin with Anthony Sutton. Anthony Sutton's work, he's worked for I think it was the Hoover Institute until he was fired, is completely revolutionary in a way that would make Noam Chomsky's analysis of American Cold War foreign policy seem mundane and establishment friendly. Sutton really goes to the heart of the matter. And the set of works that will be most useful in analyzing the Russian Revolution and Civil War is his book Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, which was published in 1974, and then his three-part series on technical transfers to the Soviet Union from the West, primarily the United States, leading from, say, like 1917 to 1965, when the book was around there finished up. Now, one of the things that Sutton points out that is very hard for people to accept today, given the polarizing influence of capitalism and communism, is that fundamentally international communism would be inconceivable without the initial infusion of capital by Western bankers, largely English and American, British and American bankers. The only bank that was not nationalized in the entire Soviet Union under Vladimir Lenin was the Morgan Chase Bank branch in St. Petersburg. In fact, he was the manager of that branch. He even went before a congressional hearing to discuss what he knew about the events that happened in Russia. Now, the capitalists were funding both sides in that Civil War and Revolution, but the preponderance did go to the Reds. There's the great figure, little-known figure, Raymond Robbins, who was the Morgan Chase agent in Russia, who basically was on a scouting mission to scope out the possibility for concessions in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And the amount of power he wields is tremendous. And when he's also investigated by the congressional hearing, he's telling stories about how Lenin and Trotsky were just waiting on his every whim. In fact, he at one point gave an anecdote where he said that if you guys don't get this under control quickly enough, we can't be sure that I can't guarantee that Westerners will invest in your country. They'll see it as a security risk. And he was one of the very common pro-socialist, pro-left-wing capitalists in the West. We see this outlook with Gillette, the founder of the razor company. He wrote a book called World Corporation, where he merged corporate management with socialism. And in the 1930s, New Dealer administrators would say that what's the difference if the economy is run by 12 commissars or 12 members of the New Deal Party? Because there's this kind of convergence that happens. Now, part of the ideological convergence is explained by Oswald Spengler, where he argues that capitalism and communism are actually striving for the same end. They differ on how to get there. And as long as they're on the same, fighting for the same end, they can collaborate together. He gives the example of how the popular unrest in the Roman Republic was fueled by wealthy patricians who wanted to change the status quo to then become the new power brokers. In his Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Sutton points out that Trotsky, who had been exiled to the United States, was picked up in 1917 by Canadian Coast Guards, and they knew he was an international terrorist, well known, and they called their superiors and asked what should they do with Leon Trotsky, and they were told by their superiors to let him go. Now, this is on par with Lenin on the train from Geneva, or from Zurich, rather. And so, because without Trotsky, there's no Red Army. If there's no Red Army, the Bolsheviks get crushed. So this should be as well known as Lenin leaving the train at Zurich, but it's not. We see also with the American interests in Russia at the time of the revolution, there was a strong Jewish influence, the Warburgs and the Schiffs. In fact, I think it was the Schiff, Jacob Schiff, bragged in his own autobiography that he helped fund the revolution. Now, by that, he meant the February, not the October Revolution. But the idea of funding insurgents to bring down the Russian government was a long-term strategy. There on the Rockefeller website, they report that in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 and 1905, 50,000 Russian POWs were brainwashed with socialist pamphlets distributed by a George Kennan, not the George Kennan who we've been quoting tonight, but his, I think, uncle. And they became the cadres in 1905 and presumably 1917 revolutions. And that was funded by the Schiffs. So these banking establishments, so the Jewish element was angry at the Russian anti-Semitism. And they wanted to pay back the Russians for hurting their people, kind of like, mafiosi style. You cross us, we're going to cross you. The more Gentile component, the Anglo-American component was more just profit-oriented. People don't realize this, but Soviet Russia was a patchwork of concessions in the 1920s and 30s. We often see in socialist propaganda of today, the world, instead of having nations' flags, it has the flags of corporations, indicating the corporations rule the world, not nations. Well, you could have had a map of the Soviet Union in 1930 and just had, instead of the flag of the Soviet Union, flags of corporations according to the concessions which they were given, and in part due to the discoveries made by Raymond Robbins and his scouting expedition. And we see that Raymond Robbins kind of the head out of the bag when he was being interviewed by the Congress in the Congress hearings. He said that he was asked by a British, during the revolution, by a British colleague, what were we doing in Russia? And he's like, well, suppose that, we were two wolves dividing up Russia between ourselves to keep the Germans out. And that's really all there was to it. It was something that crass. Russia was largely run by Germans in the Tsarist era. With Peter the Great's ascension to the throne, he took advantage of the highly educated Baltic Germans to help manage his estate. They were not Russian, they were Germanic, so they were hardworking, honest, reliable. Now, for being such a small minority within the empire, they had massive control over the bureaucracy. They were also loyal, right? Because Peter the Great had just overthrown the boyars and all these other Russians that were loyal to the old order. And he needed new people that he could trust. So these are the Baltic Germans. And the Germans did a lot of the management of the Russian Empire, which led to a sort of natural German-Russian détente, which theoretically could have led to a great rapprochement between Germany and Russia. And so the natural orbit that Russia would go to for economic development would be Germany, not England or the United States. And they wanted to shut Germany out, and that's also part of the causes of the First World War as well, in that they wanted to keep those markets for themselves. And of course, the United States did get the lion's share of the markets in the Soviet Union, the concessions and things like that. And during the Civil War, there was the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, which was sent to Siberia under, I think his name was William Graves. And he was initially tasked with rescuing the Czech Legion. The Czech Legion was a Czech contingent of Austro-Hungarian POWs that had been captured by the Russians and initially fought against the Bolsheviks, but basically just wanted to get back home as quickly as possible. And his stated objective was to retrieve them, and he did ultimately retrieve them. But Graves is also one of those, as Lenin would call, useful idiots for communism. He wrote in his memoirs of his experiences in Siberia in the Russian Civil War. He is accused of helping the Bolsheviks. And I quote, "Many times Russians and General Knox had said to me, 'You are helping the Bolsheviks,' or 'People are accusing the Americans of helping the Bolsheviks.' My invariable reply was that if any American military representative had taken sides, they would have violated the orders of the United States government. And if they could cite any act of American military that did not accord with these orders, I would apologize to the Russians and disavow the act." And their inevitable reply was, "By not supporting Kolchak, you are encouraging the Bolsheviks to think the United States is supporting them." There are some truths in this claim. So he even admits to have obstructed the white effort in order to help Bolshevism. And two examples point this out clearly. Kolchak had ordered weapons and ammunition from the United States to be delivered to him. Now, they were to be delivered via the AEF. Graves did not give him those rifles until after he had been defeated in a massive decisive engagement with the Russian General Tukhachevsky. By that point, the rifles were useless. The armies were destroyed and routed. And the other thing that Graves did as well, paving the way for Russian hegemony over the area, is he actively thwarted any attempts by the Japanese, who were more than willing to collaborate with white generals and give them aid to help solidify their control of Eastern Russia. And so we have this useful idiot who's at every turn helping the Bolsheviks out. And when the United States leaves Vladivostok, the main reason why we supported this is that we wanted a captive market. We assumed that communism would not be able to develop properly or effectively, and in so doing, we could then capitalize on that market. So what are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, there's a lot of things I think have to be considered in terms of the relationship between the West and the Russian Revolution and the development of communism in the Soviet Union. There's actually an interesting far left critique of the Russian Revolution that has been advanced by, obviously by anarchists, but also by some more left wing Marxists, the kinds of people that Lenin referred to as infantile leftists, that is, the council communists, the followers of Rosa Luxemburg, some of these kinds of people, that is, the anti Leninist Marxists. There's a critique of the Russian Revolution which says that the Russian Revolution was essentially a continuation of the bourgeois revolutions that happened during in the United States, that led to the founding of the United States, in France, and then which argues that the Russian Revolution was a continuation of this tradition. Ironically, it's not unlike some of the critiques of these revolutions that the traditional right has. But there's a strand of the far left that will argue that in all of these revolutions, what you had was a situation where the upper middle class, or the rising middle class, that was frustrated by had its political ambitions frustrated by an entrenched state system or bureaucratic system or whatever, or social system, essentially carried out a revolution and established a more middle class oriented system, and as opposed to a socialist system or a working class system. And I think a case can actually be made for that. I think a case can certainly be made that there's certainly a trajectory between the American, French, and Russian revolutions. And I think that one thing that was different about the Russian Revolution is by the time that happened, there had been a change in in left-wing thinking on an international level, where liberalism of the classical kind had already started to fade and had been replaced by the influence of a more something of an anti-liberal modernism influenced by thinkers like Rousseau and then later Marx, and consequently socialism, and also by a more aggressive scientism. You started to see in the 19th century a more aggressive scientism develop that was all about the scientific management of society. You saw that in the rise of the American progressive movement in opposition to classical liberalism. But I also think Leninism in many ways and Marxism before it were even more aggressive versions of the same idea, this idea of scientific socialism. And when the Russian Revolution happened, this is the kind of thinking that became dominant in their state system, this belief in scientism, this belief in a scientifically managed society, this kind of anti-liberal liberalism, if you will, that is something that was sort of a radical left that in many ways repudiated classical liberalism in favor of a more extreme point of view. And as far as the relationship between Leninism and between Western capitalism, from what I know of Lenin's actual behavior when he was head of state in Russia, I think that if Lenin had lived longer, if instead of being in power only 7 years, if he had been in power, say, another 20 or 30 years, I suspect he would have taken Russia in a direction not dissimilar to what the Chinese pursued after Mao died, or not dissimilar to what the Vietnamese have pursued in the post-Ho period. And that is, Lenin seemed to be moving Russia towards a type of state capitalism very similar to what the Chinese practice today. That is, the market system and capitalism and markets and profits and investors and all that are allowed, but it's still under the hegemony of this one-party communist system. That seems to be what the new economic policy that Lenin implemented actually was. And as you mentioned, there were capitalists who were also Marxists during this time. The Arm & Hammer baking soda company is one example. You mentioned the example of Gillette, but the Arm & Hammer baking soda company was actually owned by socialists who belonged to the De Leonist group, the Socialist Labor Party in North America. That's why they actually have this kind of Marxist kind of hammer and sickle looking logo for Arm and Hammer baking soda. Then there was the man, Armand Hammer. He was the son of a communist, a Western communist, who actually got involved in doing business in Russia during the time that Lenin was there. When he was very young, he was only in his early 20s, and he was setting up oil deals with the Bolshevik government and things like that. So it's not as much of a reach between capitalism and communism in this way. And if you see them as, all of these revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, as a type of middle class revolution against the traditional order, then it's easier to see a connection between them, even if there's some ideological differences that reflected the ideological differences in the international left that emerged during the periods between the revolutions. And if you understand the relationship between Western capital and communism, you start to see how these kinds of things could have come into being. Now, when Stalin was in power, of course, Stalin reversed the new economic policy. He said that Lenin had been out of his mind when he implemented those policies due to his stroke and things like that. But even Stalinism received a fair amount of support from the West in World War II in terms of military development. And so there's not as much of a break there either. So it is interesting to see how Western capital in many ways created at least the circumstances in which Soviet communism could actually exist.
Yeah. Since we're nearing the end of our allotted time, I just want to end with a warning from George Kennan. He says, "A nation which excuses its own failures by the secret untouchableness of its own habits can excuse itself into complete disaster. I said in the first of these lectures that the margin in which it is given to us to commit blunders has been drastically narrowed in the last 50 years. He's writing in 1950. If it were the workings of our democracy that were inadequate in the past, let us say so. Whoever thinks that the future is going to be easier than the past is certainly mad. And the system under which we are going to have to continue to conduct foreign policy is, I hope and pray, the system of democracy." This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.